Welcome to the lecture on measuring sustainability. This lecture has 3 parts and the first 2 are very short. We will first have a look at the general indicator groups that can be derived from the socio-ecological systems theory. We will then have a quick look at the indicators that are associated with the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we will in the third part have a long list of indicators at the different system levels that are used to measure sustainability and sustainable development. If we look at the general concept of socio-ecological systems, we see that there are 3 realms: the biophysical reality, the social reality, and the overlap between the 2. So for all 3 groups, we can define indicators. We have environmental indicators like atmospheric CO2 concentration or biodiversity measures. We have socio-metabolic indicators like anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions or water and material use. And we have social indicators like total economic performance, GDP, or income inequality. These are the general 3 types of indicators which can always be used to categorize the indicators that are around. Actually, this lecture could be very short because all we can do if we talk about sustainable development indicators is to look at the 17 UN SDGs and see what targets and indicators are used and promoted there. These indicators have been derived from a very comprehensive policy development process that is also ongoing because this is not a fixed list, but this list is continuously updated. So here as an example, there is a list of all the indicators that are directly relevant for renewable energy, which is mostly goal number 7, but also one indicator appears again in goal number 12. So we want to know what is the proportion of population with access to electricity, or we want to know how much installed renewable energy capacity is there in different countries, especially in the developing world. So we can go into the different countries and measure those indicators, and then we can say something about the status of sustainable development according to the UN framework. But of course, there's much more to measure and many more things to consider. So although the UN Sustainable Development Indicator list is very comprehensive, there's even more things to be measured, to be considered, because there are many more discourses in different countries, different societies that may not be captured fully by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what we want to do in the main part of this lecture is to go through the 4 different system levels that we defined previously, which is the process, product, or per capita level first, so the very, let's say, local level for sustainable development. Then we have the process cluster level, so the industrial park, for example. Then we have the product supply chain, life cycles, and material cycle levels, the third one. And we have the overall system level, so how does a society or an economy as a whole perform relating to certain sustainable development goals. And we will go through different examples at the different system levels to try to get a comprehensive picture of how sustainability and sustainable development can be measured. At the process levels, things are rather simple. We can have this individual process, for example, a random energy conversion process. We have an input energy, we have a useful output, and we have losses. So we would, for such processes or product, define simple efficiency indicators, material efficiency or energy efficiency, of course, and we can then compare different products, for example, different fridges regarding the energy performance, different vehicles regarding the energy use, different buildings regarding their energy use per square meter, for example. This is all done at the per capita or per process product level. And it's rather simple, and there will be many examples in the lectures that are more dedicated to energy supply and use. So here we only introduce this general category, but won't go into specific examples. Instead, we would continue with a process cluster level, where we can do the same thing as we do at the process level, just we have an open black box. So within that large process, which is here the dashed dotted line, the industrial cluster, we have many sub-processes like power stations, paper mills, and so on. So different industrial enterprises that can reuse each other's waste and energy to the extent where it's possible and economic. And overall, we can then define efficiency measures, input-output indicator based on that cluster level. Also here, examples can be found elsewhere. This is only the rough category. What is interesting in the context of sustainability is especially the levels 3 and 4. So where we really can look at the systems picture and try to be comprehensive, study entire product life cycles from the cradle to the grave, or study even system levels, how entire economies perform. So let's start with the product life cycle level. Here we want to capture the entire life cycle impact of the product. We don't only look at its production and not only at its use phase, but at all phases together. So in the example of photovoltaic modules, we would start from the silicon smelting and refining and go all the way through module assembly, the use phase, where of course the useful electricity is harvested, to the recycling and end-of-life utilization stage. And at each stage of the product life cycle, we have losses, we have energy consumption, we have some emissions of potentially hazardous chemicals, and we can sum them all up. All of these flows that are associated with the product life cycle can be summed up, and this then gives you indicator of the total embodied energy or embodied greenhouse gas emissions. So the definition is shown here. Embodied greenhouse gas emissions are all greenhouse gas emissions that occur within a product's life cycle. It doesn't mean that these greenhouse gas emissions are in the product, right? They have been emitted as the product was made and once it's destroyed or recycled again. So all these emissions or energy flows together summed up give the embodied emissions or embodied energy flows. So this is the basic principle of a product life cycle indicator. At the systems level, we can measure the total energy and material throughput through a national economy. So we can see what is the total energy consumption, everything that we extract from the natural environment to use within our economy, and the same for material. We can also have output indicators that tell us something about the total processed outputs, everything that we send back as waste, either hazardous or inert, back to the environment. And the same with energy. We can see what is the energy throughput through our economy. So these were the more theoretical conceptualizations of the 4 indicator levels, and now let's dive into the different examples. We have, as a main example for sustainable development indicators, the per capita greenhouse gas emissions at the territorial level. So this picture here gives you the per capita greenhouse gas emissions of a certain year. It's 2009 as a reference here, sorted by the magnitude. So on the left side you have the high emitting countries, on the right side you have the low emitting countries, and the x-axis is the total population of each country, so that the area of each bar gives you the total greenhouse gas emissions. So here we capture 2 system levels at the same time. The y-axis is per capita, and the total area under the curve is the system level indicators that tell you how the total national total is and how it relates to the climate target. Another prominent systems level indicators is the ecological footprint. This indicator is very prominent and it has been around for around 30 years. It's a measure of how much land, productive land, is needed to provide the services to us, the ecosystem services that we need as a society to have the lifestyle that we live currently. The ecological footprint in many countries is larger than the actual available productive land. So we can say that many countries, especially the rich countries, exceed the biocapacity that natural ecosystems provide to us. And we can also see where these exceedance comes from. Therefore, we need to understand that the ecological footprint is an area measure, but it has different components. We use different impacts that are converted into a common area measure. And these different components are the build-up land, the fishing grounds, the different cultivated land types, grazing land, cropland, and forests, and the hypothetical land, especially forests, that would be needed to sequester all our carbon emissions. So here we already see that the ecological footprint is a very specific concept, because it tells us the hypothetical land that we would need to absorb our carbon emissions, which mostly actually stay in the atmosphere and in the ocean. So the blue component that's shown here in this figure is the one that actually changes drastically over time, is the component of the ecological footprint, the hypothetical land that would be needed to sequester our carbon emissions. It's not there, and this is why we say we live in ecological overshoot, we exceed the biocapacity of our planet. The criticism that is frequently brought about against the ecological footprint, that it kind of hides the fact that the big driving component of the ecological footprint is actually the carbon footprint component. It is a bit an indicator that's a bit opaque because it has many different components, but the actual main and relevant component is the carbon footprint. So we will see that there's also other ways of calculating footprints. One of the methods is the ecological footprint, but we can also keep the different environmental impacts separate. And this is what we will see in the next slide here. We will define the specific footprints for greenhouse gas emissions, water, land, and materials, and so on. Therefore, we study global supply chains. Global supply chains are the industrial relationships that go all the way from resource extraction to fabrication, manufacturing, and then to the delivery of the product or the service to the consumer. And along the supply chains, as we saw already for the life cycle perspective indicators, we have accumulated impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, land and water use, and so on. And we can sum them all up, and this sum then gives you the footprint associated with a certain product. So the difference between the carbon footprint, for example, and the ecological footprint is that the carbon footprint measures the actual carbon emissions along the supply chain, and the unit is greenhouse gas equivalent, CO2 equivalents. The ecological footprint in turn also measures the different impacts along the product supply chain, but it converts them into a land area that's hypothetical. So the land, water, material, and carbon footprints are closer to the actual emissions that happen or the actual resource use, so they are more tangible. Whereas the ecological footprint is complementary to that. It's more aggregate and more useful for policy communication, for example. But let's now for the moment stick with the actual footprints of resources and emissions and look at the carbon footprint of a person, so the actual carbon emissions in a person's supply chain. And we see that for rich people, many commodity groups contribute. We have the use of fuels, we have the use of airplane, other transport modes, we have the food, of course, and the mobility, which is very important here. So many consumption groups contribute, and there's a lot of studies these days that measure the carbon footprint and other footprint of different income groups to see what happens as people get richer. What do they consume and where in their supply chain and in their expenditure budget the emissions actually occur. An interesting example of the footprint for land is the aggregated land use of a developed country, here for Germany. So on the left side of this graph, we see the territorial land use in Germany and the different groups where it is used for. So we have direct land use by gardens, for example, we have land use for food, and we have land use for construction materials and timber production, for example. Almost the entire area of the country is used somehow in a productive manner, but we see that on the right side, the land footprint of the country is much, much larger because we have a lot of land that is embodied in imports, as the jargon says, and that means to import the goods and commodity that we need here, a lot of land is used for their production. For example, land area in Brazil to farm soy for animal fodder, or land area in Russia for timber production. So all of this land, which is actually in productive use, is now associated with the final consumption in Germany of the goods and services that are produced on that land. And that means the total land footprint of this country is much larger than the own country is. It's about 3 times the area of the country. Because globally, we use for our consumption here so much land in other countries to be productive to generate the resources that we then consume here. We can, with the models we have, also roughly say where that land lies. So we already mentioned Russia and South America, but there are also other continents and world regions that contribute to the land footprint of a specific country. So we see that in a globalized world, we have an exchange of resources across the globe, and it also means that we can associate land use in one country with consumption in another country. So we establish a system linkage. And it's of course interesting to find out, and this is a scientific research question, to what extent we can scale such land footprint and to what extent this is actually sustainable or can be considered sustainable. We have here another summary of the difference between the land footprint and the ecological footprint, and I leave it up to you to read that slide. We want to continue with a very important system level indicators, and this is an indicator for the colonization of nature. What do we mean by that? In environmental accounting and most branches of environmental science, we postulate that there is a division between the anthroposphere and the natural environment. Anthroposphere is the place where human controls what happens. For example, in cities. Cities are no wild places. Cities are very structured. There's a lot of concrete, a lot of pavements, built environment. So here, humans exert high levels of control. Whereas in a rainforest, humans exert very little control, sometimes no control at all. So we can postulate that somewhere in between the city and the rainforest, the natural rainforest, there is a control barrier. We can say we control things on one side but don't control things on the other side. And as humans go out and cultivate parts of nature, we shift that control boundary. So we would cultivate natural land or pristine forests and turn them into plantations or fields. And by that, we engage in the process of colonizing the natural environment. And colonizing here means two things. It means A, we create a deliberate change, so we have a plan that we want to change something to become productive for us, and we actively maintain those parts of nature, which are now part of the cultural landscape. So the two aspects, deliberate change and active maintenance, are the two characteristics of the process colonization of nature. And we can try to measure this colonization, and the main indicator here is called HANPP, the human appropriation of net primary production. So what does it mean? It means that we have at the Earth surface a certain amount of photosynthesis going on. Photosynthesis creates new biomass. And the question is now, how much of that biomass is actually not used by nature in a sense that the trees grow just the way they grow, but is channeled into our economy. For example, by animals. They eat the fodder, and so the whole thing is now converted into an economic output. Or by sawmills, or by farms that harvest grain. So we want to understand how productive is the Earth as a whole, and how much of the productivity of the Earth is channeled into the human economy, which means at the same time it's not available to other species. So it's kind of a competition thing here between what humans can use in terms of resources produced, biomass produced, and what other species can use. So there are three maps that we can use to understand this issue. The first map is the net primary production of the potential vegetation. So assume a world without humans. We can model such a world, and we can also model how much photosynthesis there would happen in such a world. You can see here the photosynthesis activity measured in grams of carbon captured per square meters and year in a world without humans present. Now we switch on our own present, and we can measure the actual photosynthesis activity in a world with humans. And this map looks slightly different. I'm going to switch back slides. You see here a slightly different coloring than here. Look in particular at the Nile area in Egypt, which under absence of human is non-productive, but with humans is highly productive because of all the irrigation. So we see that human presence alters the productivity of global ecosystems. But not only that, we also harvest photosynthesis products, biomass from these ecosystems. And this is now shown on the third map, where we can actually now show the so-called human appropriation of the net primary production. So this is the total net extraction from the ecosystems through human activities. And you see this map is reddish or for most parts of the planet, because humans are net consumers of ecosystem products, of biomass. And it differs across the world depending on how intensively we use the natural ecosystem. So in countries like India or Central Europe, we have a lot of farming, very intense agriculture. So most of the biomass that's produced with photosynthesis enters the human economy in some form or the other. But we also have a few world regions where the human impact on available biomass is net negative, because even though humans harvest biomass, for example in northern Egypt, there's so much other biomass left through other species, than there would be without human presence. So the humans are, so to say, net providers through their activity, net providers of biomass to other ecosystems. And if we sum up this map across the globe, we see that the human appropriation of the world's photosynthesis products is about 1/4 of the total productivity that the world would have without us present. So 1 out of 4 kilos of biomass that's produced with photosynthesis is channeled through our economy and not available to other species and the natural ecosystems. We continue our journey through the system level indicators for sustainable development, and very relevant indicators as well are the total global energy consumption and total global material consumption. So on the left part you see the big increase in global energy consumption since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, divided into biomass and the fossil fuels, coal, oil and natural gas mostly. On the right side you see the same graph but for material consumption this time, so how many materials enter the human economy. Also here biomass has dominated pictures for thousands of years, but only in the 20th century was then surpassed by the non-biomass materials, especially the fossil fuels, and of course also the construction materials, which today are the largest contributor to total human material use. And here you see the same graph but in percent. So you see that the share of biomass in total energy material consumption declines over time and is partly replaced by fossil fuels and by non-metallic minerals and also metals for the material side. And the question is, of course, how far can this process continue? How many resources can the Earth deliver in the long run? And how can these resources be supplied in a way that doesn't infer too much on the natural biocapacity? So these are big sustainability questions, and indicators like the ones presented here of course help us understand the picture and first get the numbers right. We can zoom into our own economy and try to understand how circular it is. Circular means that ideally we have products that don't go to waste but are recycled instead. So we can capture the valuable resources in the products, the plastics, the metal, the construction materials, and recycle them. So we save natural resources and at the same time we also reduce ecosystem damage. But you see that in reality the picture looks very different. There is recycling at the global scale, but it's that relatively tiny circle, tiny compared to the big resource flows that we have to operate our economy. So the big yellow and green ones are the fossil fuel and biomass flows. So these are throughput flows for energy use because they're only used once, and then the waste is sent back to the environment. And we have the big orange flows. These are all the construction minerals that we use to increase the build-up stocks, the urban environment. So there is not much circularity, so to say, yet at the planetary scale. And of course this is something to change in the future if we as a society, as global society, want to become sustainable. We are far from that goal, and Sankey diagrams like the one here can help us understand where we are on that journey towards circularity. We can also define system level indicators at the social side of things. Here we show two types of income inequality plots. The first one is we plot on the left side the frequency of people having a certain personal income over that income. So you see the distribution. We have almost no people with very little income, and then we have a large number of people with medium income, and we have a few super rich people, and even on the right side of the left graph some very, very rich people, but it's only very few of them. And this inequality in incomes means that different people have different incomes can also be plotted differently in the so-called Lorenz curve. This you see on the right side. Here we plot the share of total income over the share of total population sorted by per capita income. So as we count people ranked by their income, we see that first on the left side of the right plot we have, let's say for the red curve, very little increase in cumulative income, and only the last 20% really earn most of the income, 80% or so here. So then the cumulative income curve increases a lot for the red case. For perfect equality, we would say if we increase population by 1% in our graph, we also increase the cumulative income by 1%. So we get a straight line. A straight line is a perfectly equal society where everybody has exactly the same income. And the more unevenly the income is distributed, the more bent this curve is. So the orange curve here would be a society with medium inequality, and the red curve would be a society with high inequality. We can, for this Lorenz curve, define the so-called Gini coefficient, which is the area between the actual distribution and the perfect distribution, so the area A, divided by the total area. And if you look at this equation, definition equation, a bit more closely, you realize, well, in a perfectly equal society, the Lorenz curve equals the line of equality, so area A is 0. That means the Gini coefficient would be 0. And in a perfectly unequal distribution, where one person owns everything, the area B would be 0, so the Gini coefficient would be 1. And now we can look at the data and see how unequally income is distributed across regions. So we see there's huge discrepancy. So we have countries that are relatively equal in terms of income distribution, most famously the Scandinavian countries, and we have countries with a lot of income inequality, especially in Southern Africa, but also South America. And these countries are also the ones that are really challenged in terms of their social sustainability. Again, as noted before in another lecture, the vision of having more equal income distribution is not primarily a socialist vision. It's often a necessity to avoid social unrest and in general a very lack of good governance and human well-being and happiness. And we see, this is now a picture for 2006, that income equality changes over time. So we switch now 8 years ahead in time into 2014, and you can see, if you go in your video back and forth between the 2 years, that some countries actually managed to become more equal and other countries managed to become less equal. That really depends on your economic policy and on your social policy. And for many countries, kind of trying to steer or govern the Gini coefficient of income inequality is a major component of social and economic policy, and thus also of sustainable development policy. As we continue our journey of indicators, we now come to the gross domestic product. So if we sum up the income of all people and adjust for some taxation, we end up at the total value of the goods and services delivered by an economy, which is roughly a description of the measure gross domestic product. So everything that's final goods, so that leaves the economy and is then consumed, contributes to the gross domestic product of one country. We also know from traveling that a certain currency unit in one country can buy less than the same currency unit converted to currency in another country. So there is a purchasing power difference between same currency values in different countries. So many people argue to actually use the GDP, the gross domestic product, in a comparative fashion, we should convert the nominal GDP into one that's corrected for purchasing power differences. And this resulting indicator is called the GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, so converted to a way that one currency unit of this GDP buys you the same amount of services in every country. And this indicator looks slightly different then the nominal GDP. So here first the nominal GDP, and this is quite a known figure, or at least intuitively it's clear that the countries of Europe and North America and also Australia and New Zealand are very rich countries, so they have a very high per capita GDP, which is just a fancy way of saying they're very rich. And we have countries with medium GDP, South America, Southern Africa, and also large parts of Central and Northern Asia. And we have the rather poor countries in terms of GDP, so that's parts of Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And we know from correlations that too little GDP means extreme poverty, so lack of access to energy service, lack of access to health service, education. So this is really then a prime target of global economic development policy to bring these countries and large parts of the population out of extreme poverty. We switch now to the purchase power corrected GDP, which roughly has the same pattern as the nominal GDP, but there are slight differences. So this is a world map showing you how much people get for their money. So the nominal GDP is just how much money people have, and this is a map showing how much you get for it in terms of goods and services from a standardized consumption basket. And if you compare those two slides, you will see there's tiny differences. For example, here the purchase power in Brazil is a bit different compared to its neighboring countries than the GDP relationship. Or also India, even though India has a rather low GDP, if you convert it to purchase power, India is a bit better off than if you look at its nominal GDP. There is in accounting a very specific way of defining what the GDP is. So it's not directly related to personal income, but it's the personal income corrected for taxes that we have, for social security contributions, and also for corporate income taxes. So there is a very specific way of calculating the GDP, so it roughly reflects personal income, but not exactly. We have now defined system-level indicators for total material and energy throughput and system-level indicators for total economic output. And in the next step, we want to relate the two to each other by defining the economy-wide resource efficiency or resource productivity. And it's very simple. We just divide the material consumption of an economy by its entire GDP. So we get an indicator that tells you how many materials do you need for producing €1 or other currency unit of economic output. That would be the resource efficiency of the economy, and you can use the inverse of this indicator. So this is GDP per material used, and this is then the resource productivity of an economy. And these indicators are shown here. So we have the GDP as the economic lead indicator at the systems level, and we have the total RMC, raw material consumption, also at the economy level. And resource productivity would be GDP divided by RMC. So you see here for this region, the EU27, the resource productivity has been steadily increasing since the year 2000, from 100% in the year 2000 to 130% 12 years later. So we can say here that as GDP continued to grow, raw material consumption has first increased as well, but then decreased a lot. So until 2008, we had what we call relative decoupling. Relative decoupling means that both indicators grew, but RMC grew slower than GDP. And since 2008, we have had absolute decoupling because the overall level of RMC declined. Both relative decoupling and absolute decoupling lead to an increase in resource productivity over time. But it's clear that to become sustainable, for example, meeting our climate targets, resource productivity and also energy productivity needs to increase a lot more. And we will definitely need also absolute reduction or absolute decoupling of carbon emission and other major environmental indicators. You may be familiar with another major system level indicator, here in the form of an equation, the IPAT accounting equation. So when we take an environmental impact indicator, for example total greenhouse gas emissions, we can break it down into three components. The first one is the population as a driver. The second one is the per capita affluence, and the third one is the technology level, the aggregate emissions per unit of affluence. So if you put these terms together, you will see that population cancels out, because the A is total GDP divided by P, and T, technology, is total impact I divided by total GDP. So this accounting equation always holds, and it tells you how a system performs overall. So what are the contributions of population, of affluence, and of technology to a certain impact, and how do these factors change over time? So this is a major, very important tool to roughly understand the population dynamics, the affluence dynamics, and the technological change over time of an economy as a whole, and how these different factors contribute to overall environmental impacts. The planetary boundaries are also system level indicators, because here we have the Earth system as a whole that provides boundaries, physical boundaries to human activities. These boundaries are not hard boundaries, but they are certain levels beyond which we enter in an unknown area of the Earth's system, and also an area where the chance that we cross irreversible tipping points increases a lot. So these are indicators that we can use to measure the performance of our economy as a whole in terms of how well we do in keeping in a safe operating space at the global level. There's a lot of science behind the planetary boundaries, even though they appear as quite simple, and it's important to understand that the boundaries are not fixed boundaries again, but rather they are soft boundaries. They tell us when the area of an increase of crossing tipping points in the Earth's biogeochemical system increases. An interesting example for applying planetary boundaries in practice is to take personal carbon footprints and see how they compare against planetary boundaries. So how do you do that? A personal footprint is a level 3 indicator, right? It's a footprint per capita. Planetary boundary is a level 4 indicator. We have to do some kind of upscaling. Here, again, for the example of Germany, we have a couple of environmental footprints calculated. So we have greenhouse gases, agricultural land use, and water use, for example. For the total population in Germany, we have, for example, in the year given here, a total of 1,145 megatons of greenhouse gases or CO2 equivalents, and certain units for water, materials, and land use. Now, assuming that everybody on the planet has the same consumption level as we here in Germany, we can scale up the German footprints to the global level using the current population. This gives you the second column with numbers from the left. So we would have a certain global emissions and land use and so on if everybody would have the same footprints as we here. And this is a global indicator, so by this upscaling we can directly compare this global indicator to the planetary boundaries. And we realize that in that case, in that hypothetical situation, we would exceed the climate boundary by a factor of 10. We would also exceed the boundary for agricultural land by a factor of 1.4, meaning that the lifestyle here in Germany is not upscalable to the globe, because simply we don't have enough land. It is at least scalable for total land and also for water use. That of course doesn't mean that there's no local water shortages, but at the global level for the planetary boundaries, our lifestyle is, so to say, relatively safe in terms of the planetary boundaries, but it's definitely not safe for agricultural land, it's not scalable, and not at all safe for greenhouse gas emissions. So this kind of calculation and comparison shows you the perspective. What are really the big environmental problems that we need to tackle for a certain country. We want to close this journey through the Sustainable Development Indicators by moving to the social level. One of the major social indicators for sustainability is the Human Development Index. It is defined as written down here on this slide and has 3 different components. The first one is we want to see whether people can live a long and healthy life, so we use a life expectancy index as the first component. Knowledge is a very important dimension of human well-being as well, so we have an education index. That's the second component. And the third one is a decent standard of living, here measured by gross national income, so an income index. And we put those 3 indices together by first normalizing them, showing here in equation 1 to get a dimension index, and then calculating the geometric mean between the 2 indicators. So this is how the Human Development Index is defined, as a way of weighing together these major social performance indicators: national income per person, education index, and also life expectancy. We can now see how different countries perform both for life expectancy and for the HDI as an example, and you see also that these 2 variables are strongly correlated, meaning when life expectancy at birth is high, also the HDI tends to be high. And this is a natural consequence because HDI has as one of its components the life expectancy of birth, so there is a correlation. This is not a surprising finding, but more or less a consequence of the definition of the indicator. A more interesting finding is that the HDI tends to decouple from GDP growth. So you see at the left side of this graph that as countries are very poor, a small difference in GDP makes a big difference for human development. But as countries get very rich, as they pass an income threshold of roughly $10,000 per year, you see that an increased income doesn't translate into further increase of human development. So there is what we could say a sufficiency threshold of roughly $10,000 per year, which is sufficient for a decent life in terms of the HDI, and this may give a hint on whether or not a perpetual economic growth is required for sustainable development for human flourishing, but that's only a very rough indication. Interestingly, we have the same finding for carbon emissions. So as we have very low levels of human development, more carbon emissions, at least empirically, mean huge improvements in Human Development Index, because we need carbon emissions from the fossil fuels to provide energy, to provide services. Services improve the life of very poor people: health, water, sanitation, electricity, transportation, communication, and so on. But once you reach a certain carbon threshold, even higher carbon emissions caused by even higher energy consumption don't translate into higher human development. So this is also a very important finding for sufficiency and for decoupling. At very low levels of development, we have a strong coupling between carbon emissions and Human Development Index. So the slope of these curves shown here is very high, it's very steep. And as carbon emissions increase further beyond like 3 tons per capita, these curves turn very flat. So there's not a strong coupling. We have now reached the end of our journey through the different sustainability and sustainable development indicators. And at last, we want to present a compound indicator, the so-called Happy Planet Index. It's a funny name, but it actually describes the components of it. Happy planet. So happy means people should be happy and the planet should be happy. And the way it's defined is that we put into relation an aggregate happiness indicator of people by the ecological footprint. So the happiness indicator is life expectancy multiplied by experienced well-being. So you can live very long lives but rather unhappy, that would score very low here. But if you have a long and happy life, the denominator of this term will be very high, and if you at the same time have a very low ecological footprint, the overall score will be very high. The HPI Happy Planet Index will be very high. So you can see how it's measured here now, and you can also see some rough results on this map. So this is one of the alternatives to just focusing on GDP when it comes to measuring not only the economic side but also the social and environmental side of sustainability. But again, this is only one suggestion, it's not the indicators. There are many other ones that are being promoted and currently developed, and I hope that this lecture could give you a rough overview of the different indicators that are out there. We couldn't capture all of them, that's only a fraction of them, but please do remember that the sustainable development indicators work at different system levels. So we have the process product levels, process cluster levels, life cycle level, and system level indicators, and we have the three groups: the social indicators, the environmental indicators, and the social metabolic indicators. Thank you.